And thank you for joining today's virtual educational program with Cancer Support Community Los Angeles. I am Edlyn Rodarte, and I am the Virtual Program Associate at CSCLA. I welcome you to this week's webinar titled, Your Gut Microbes Are Cancer Warriors If You Feed Them Well. This webinar encourages you to choose a variety of minimally processed fiber-rich foods daily. These foods provide the substrate needed for one's gut microbes to help you reduce the risk of cancer recurrence. Before we begin, if this is your first time joining us, Cancer Support Community Los Angeles is a premier nonprofit organization providing vital social and emotional support to families facing cancer, including patients, caregivers, and their loved ones, all at no cost. Our programs include support groups, healthy lifestyle classes, social activities, and educational programs such as this one. If you'd like to learn more about our services or watch past webinars, please visit our website at www.cancersupportla.org. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome today's speaker. Dr. McCarthy is a professor of health policy and management at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. He has devoted his 30-plus year career to using behavioral strategies to help people eat more fruits and vegetables, exercise more, and avoid tobacco use. His current work focuses on lifestyle change, approaches to reducing low-income population risk of lung cancer, breast cancer, and colon cancer. He earned a Ph.D. in psychology from Yale University in 1980, and in 1994, Dr. McCarthy received the American Cancer Society Capitol Dome Award, and in 2013, the American Cancer Society St. George's Medal for his career of volunteer service dedicated to preventing cancer. Welcome, Dr. McCarthy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome, Edlyn. Thank you very much for the introduction. I feel grateful to be here. And I'm grateful to the audience members who have joined this webinar. So I'm a professor of public health, as you've heard, at UCLA. I do research on how daily food choices affect risk of breast cancer recurrence. And I'm doing research in women who are at least 6 months beyond their diagnosis of breast cancer. I'll say more about my current research at the end of this talk. For now, I want to talk about a new approach to cancer prevention and weight control that reflects exciting new science showing how gut microbes help keep our immune and metabolic systems strong. But first, let's quickly review the evolution of nutrition science. Oh, yes, I need to be sharing my slides, don't I? So I hope everybody sees the slides. There. So for 200,000 years, the most common cause of food-related death was starvation. Not until the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s was food abundance possible. Famine was a chronic challenge for early humans and explains why the human body has multiple strategies for counteracting weight loss, which it often interprets as a starvation-related threat. In the 1700s, Dr. James Lind and other medical researchers identified micronutrient deficiencies as being responsible for avoidable food-related death. Lind famously did an experiment with sailors on long-term voyages, more than a year in length, giving some of them citrus fruits and others not. And he was at the first to show that something in citrus fruits, it turned out it was vitamin C, helped prevent scurvy. Scurvy was really bad, caused your teeth to fall out, caused you to get demented, and it killed a lot of sailors. So they were glad to find such an easy solution. Just keep lemons and limes on the chipboard. That's why the British sailors became known as limeys. Another advance in nutrition science was the identification of food contaminants, contaminants like salmonella. And you may know that in the or late 1800s, actually, 1 out of 10 children in the US didn't make it to adulthood. There's a very high infant mortality because of contaminated foods, principally contaminated milk. It was only with the advent of pasteurization that we succeeded in greatly reducing infant mortality because of contaminants. So that was a big advance. And then in the 1920s, the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company noticed that payouts for early death were disproportionately going to families with overweight people. So they were the first to point to obesity as being a problem. And of course, successive research in later years has confirmed the message that we need to maintain a good waistline if we hope to have a long life. And then finally, just very recently, thanks to the advent of high throughput gene sequencing, it used to cost $1 million to sequence a genome, and now it's getting close to $100 a sequencing. So for researchers like myself, now it's possible, economically possible, to do microbial research that we couldn't do before. So going back to obesity for a second, for the last 30 years, the most consistent approach to weight control has been to eat less. And eating less works for a while, but 95% of people who lose weight through just caloric restriction and not changing the nature of their food choices end up returning to their baseline weight. And so there's more to sustainable weight loss than simply constricting calories and taking longer to complete your meals and engaging in other attempts at restraining the overconsumption of calories. And so the answer may be to eat more of certain kinds of foods rather than to simply eat less of everything. And so what are those foods that we should be eating more of? Well, they include fiber-rich foods like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, seeds, and nuts. Increasing a variety of fiber-rich foods. So it's not enough to eat just a higher quantity, but a greater variety of fiber-rich foods. And that's because we have 500 plus different microbial species, each of which occupies a different nutritional niche. And they don't all eat the same fiber. So if you just eat one kind of fiber, there are going to be a lot of microbial species that are going to miss out. And then we need minimally processed fiber-rich foods. So this is a key innovation, minimally processed, because intrinsic fiber, which is the undisturbed fiber found naturally in fruits and vegetables, is a better fiber supplement, or we call food for the microbes substrate. It's a better substrate for the gut microbes. Plus, polyphenols are found mostly in the skin of fiber-rich foods, and they are powerful antioxidants that help to reduce inflammation. And as we will discuss, inflammation is an important contributor to a variety of avoidable diseases, not the least of which is breast cancer. And then finally, we should be eating more anti-inflammatory fats, particularly the omega-3 fatty acids. The omega-3 fatty acids are found most plentifully in fatty fish like salmon, flax seeds, chia seeds, walnuts, pecans, soybeans. And the reason why is because omega-3 fatty acids, they stimulate microbial generation of short-chain fatty acids that dampen hunger signaling. So not only do they reduce inflammation, but they reduce hunger signaling, allowing us to go longer periods before we feel the yen to eat again. So these new weight loss recommendations are consistent with the health behavior recommendations that the experts convened by the American Institute for Cancer Research say are good for preventing cancer and preventing recurrence of cancer. The traditional recommendations for weight loss include exercise regularly, limit sugar intake, limit fast food intake, limit red meat consumption, and limit alcohol intake. A relatively new recommendation is to eat more whole grains, more vegetables, more fruits, more legumes, more seeds, and nuts. Eating more can result in weighing less. When minimally processed, these foods are rich in fiber and in omega-3 fatty acids, and the dietary fiber and a diet rich in omega-3 fatty acids make our commensal microbes thrive. Thriving commensal microbes dampen the hunger signal, reduce systemic inflammation, and help to fight a variety of cancers. The traditional Japanese dietary pattern is consistent with the American Institute for Cancer Research dietary recommendations. As this graph illustrates, the Japanese experience fewer years lost to cancer than the Chinese, Europeans, or Americans. The current overall life expectancy in Japan is 84.9 years. That's nearly 85 years. In the US, it's only 77 years. Third generation Japanese Americans typically, unfortunately for them, eat the Western dietary pattern commonly consumed in the US. Their risk of breast cancer is now the same as the risk observed in the average European American, which is a lifetime risk of 1 out of 8 women. In Japan, the corresponding ratio is only 1 out of 38 women, which is a 79% reduced risk of breast cancer in Japan. So it's not the genes, it's the food. So in a landmark paper that has been cited more than 37,000 times, that's an absolute blockbuster. Senior author Robert Weinberg identified elevated systemic inflammation as one of the landmarks of cancer. Part of the reason, part of the reason why the Japanese traditional dietary pattern is associated with lower cancer risk is that it is more anti-inflammatory than the Western dietary pattern consumed in the US. So elevated systemic inflammation does not just increase cancer risk, it increases most of the chronic disease killers of Americans, including heart disease, diabetes, and fatty liver disease, Alzheimer's disease, and stroke. In fact, elevated systemic inflammation is associated with accelerated aging in general, which is part of the reason why the Japanese live so long. So the US dietary pattern, by contrast, features pro-inflammatory foods such as red meat, high-fat dairy, sugar-sweetened beverages, pastries, and pepperoni pizza. And so now we know one of the mechanisms by which food choices influence inflammation is the mediation by commensal gut microbes. So that's what's new on this slide. It's not just nutrition and physical activity. It's also the gut microbiota. From the experts come 2 lists. The first one lists factors that elevate systemic inflammation. The second one lists factors that reduce systemic inflammation. You already know the things you should be avoiding on the left. It is the list on the right that I want to concentrate on. If you want to live longer and avoid cancer, it helps to exercise regularly, to eat a lot of fatty fish, a lot of seeds and soybeans, and to double both the quantity and diversity of minimally processed fiber-rich foods, especially whole grains, fruits, vegetables, and legumes, otherwise known as beans. Getting regular sleep and engaging regularly in joyful activities like sex also help. So reactive oxygen species are highly reactive chemicals formed from elemental oxygen. Examples include peroxide, superoxide, and hydroxyl radicals. They are a major contribution to inflammation, but they also play a major role in protecting the human body from dangerous pathogens. 2 ways of reducing excess reactive oxygen species is 1, by reducing exposure to oxygen, as illustrated by the vacuum-packed slices seen in this photo, and 2, by using a layer of antioxidants as commonly found in the skin of fruits and vegetables to neutralize whatever reactive oxygen species may appear. Cooks know that they can prevent the normally rapid oxidation of apple slices by dipping the apple slices in antioxidant-rich lemon juice. The human body is more successful at creating a healthy balance of pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory processes when it has access to a large quantity of antioxidants found, as I said, most plentifully in the skins of fresh fruits and vegetables. So I've been bad-mouthing inflammation, but inflammation is our immune system's go-to strategy for protecting the human body from acute threats. That is why burns and wounds are inflamed. Inflammation is part of the healing process. Using drugs to rid our bodies of all inflammation would not be a good idea. The problem is not with inflammation per se, but with how chronic it is. Acute localized inflammation can be therapeutic and protective, but when it becomes chronic, it can lead to irreversible scarring and loss of function. The trick then is to find a good balance, which is achieved by decreasing the pro-inflammatory behaviors and increasing the anti-inflammatory behaviors so that we can reach a good balance. So this suggests that the reactive oxygen species, otherwise known as oxidative stress, has a dual role. Whether they will act as harmful, protective, or signaling factors depends on the balance, as I said, between reactive oxygen production and disposal at the right time and place. So if you can count to 6, you can provide an optimal quantity of substrate to your commensal gut microbes. Using national nutrition data collected by the Centers for Disease Control, my colleagues and I determined that most Americans were consuming only 2 highly microbiota accessible foods per day, despite the fact that obesity risk, heart disease risk, diabetes risk, stroke risk, and risk of some cancers all declined monotonically with increasing numbers of highly microbiota accessible foods up to 6 microbe-friendly foods per day. Beyond 6, the law of diminishing returns sets in, and we see no additional health benefit to consuming 7, 8, or more microbiota accessible foods per day. When researchers finally sequenced the entire human genome, they were surprised to find that humans had only 20,000 protein encoding genes, about the same number of genes as found in the minuscule worm C. elegans. The reason why humans have been able to dominate the earth, despite their limited pool of human genes, is because humans made an evolutionary compact with several thousand species of microbes. If humans provided protected environments in which the microbial species could thrive, they, in turn, the microbes, would provide the thousands of additional genes needed for optimal human metabolic and immune system functioning. Collectively, the microbial species resident in the human gut microbiome possess 2 million protein encoding genes compared to only 20,000 for the humans. So we're a super organism. Most of the genes we use are not ours, they're not human. Collectively, they are 100 times smarter than humans at extracting nutrients from the world's many thousands of diverse carbohydrate sources. So early in each person's lifespan development, proteobacteria are a major presence. The proteobacteria are of concern because many of our most virulent intestinal pathogens are species belonging to the proteobacteria phylum. So what you see here is proteobacteria are quite prevalent in the air and the ocean, but hardly at all prevalent in the human, whereas Bacteroidetes and Firmicutes are much more prevalent in the human, but quite a bit less prevalent in the air and the soil. So that comes about because the human body intentionally screens out the proteobacteria. The acid bath in the stomach kills a lot of the proteobacteria that try to enter the human body. And the rest of the immune system also is highly geared to, to limit the presence of the proteobacteria. So it should be noted that the proteobacteria are aerotolerant, and the Bacteroides and Firmicutes, almost all of them are obligate anaerobes. They don't like oxygen. They die in the air because there's too much oxygen. There is a little bit of oxygen in the intestine. In the large intestine, it's quite minimal. It's like 2%, and that's the level that these obligate anaerobes like. They thrive with 2%. If it gets much more than that, then the proteobacteria start having the advantage competitively. So as the infant gut microbiota matures, the body's immune system gets better at screening out the proteobacteria. So that's why there's a relatively large amount of proteobacteria in the neonate, the newborn. So the healthy adult has just like 4.5% on average proteobacteria. But as we get older, that gets a little bit bigger because the immune system that we have gets weaker, and the proteobacteria start coming back in greater prevalence, and particularly for those who are immunocompromised because of disease and because of cancer. So so cancer is associated with the weakened immune system, which has a harder time keeping the proteobacteria in check. Whatever we can do to reduce systemic inflammation will help our commensal gut microbes thrive and should strengthen the immune system and facilitate keeping the proteobacteria in check. So in healthy adults, more than 90% of the bacteria, as I said, are good for us and want us to thrive because their lives depend on us and we depend on them. And 5% of the bacteria in our guts are typically pathogenic, but are kept in check by our commensal bacteria if we feed them well. The infection Clostridialis difficile, otherwise known as C. diff, affects 500,000 Americans each year, and 5% of those affected will die within 30 days of diagnosis. But millions of Americans have the bug in their systems, but don't experience any symptoms because the commensal bacteria successfully keep the C. diff in check. So we really need to do a better job of keeping our commensal microbes healthy and happy. So the graphic shown in this slide comes from a review article that I consider to be a good summary of how eating saturated fat-rich foods and drinking high sugar sweetened beverages increase systemic inflammation and exacerbate obesity-related disease. It is also a good summary of how eating fiber-rich foods reduces systemic inflammation and dampens the hunger signal. So at the far left of this slide, under the big X, are all the health conditions that could be prevented by eating more minimally processed, high fiber foods and foods rich in omega-3 fatty acids. They include diseases of the liver, the kidney, and inflammatory bowel diseases. They include stroke, immunological diseases like asthma, obesity, colon cancer, and diabetes. They even include neurological diseases like Alzheimer's. By eating mostly fiber-poor, ultra-processed foods like those shown above, Americans are not achieving the recommended quantity of daily fiber intake of 25 to 30 grams of fiber from food each day. In fact, they're only doing half of that. Food manufacturers often remove fiber in the course of food processing because consumers prefer the taste. They prefer the taste of refined carbohydrates, and because removing the fiber is typically associated with a longer shelf life before the food becomes stale, moldy, or rancid, which the manufacturers, they like longer shelf life. But it's not just quantity that matters, it's also the diversity of fiber-rich foods. The randomized controlled trial results shown on the right involved a comparison between two laboratory diets that had the same amount of fiber, but in the ultra-processed diet condition, the fiber was mostly from a single fiber supplement added to lemonade. In the minimally processed food condition, all of the fiber came from a variety of whole foods, especially fruits, vegetables, and legumes. And it should be noted that the participants in this trial were encouraged to eat until they were satisfied. There was no restriction on the quantity of food that they could eat. And as you can see from the results of this crossover trial, the same individuals eating the minimally processed food diet for 2 weeks spontaneously consumed 500 fewer calories per day than when they were eating the ultra-processed food diet for 2 weeks. This difference in daily calorie intake, of course, had predictable effects on weight. Eating a variety of fiber-rich foods, minimally processed, in other words, is a practical approach to desired weight control. By minimally processed, we mean foods that are still recognizably related to how Mother Nature created them and unaccompanied by added saturated fat from farm-raised animals, particularly, added sugar, added sodium, or added emulsifiers. These added food components are pro-inflammatory and undermine the physiological conditions in the host's large intestine that are needed for our commensal microbes to thrive. The foods depicted in this photo and from the same study are minimally processed snacks. Just from looking at them, I can recognize where they came from. They do not need nutrition facts labels because what you see is what you get. By contrast, the foods depicted in this photo are highly processed snacks rich in refined carbohydrates, also salt, emulsifiers, and other ingredients that alter the taste, texture, and shelf life duration of the product. You have to read the ingredient list for most of these products to know what is in them. Everything else being equal, the greater the number of ingredients that populate the ingredient list, the more processed the food. An example of an ultra-processed food product is Hostess Twinkies. The ingredient list for Hostess Twinkies includes 47 named ingredients, including emulsifiers, preservatives, 3 kinds of sugar, etc. So each glass of lemonade in this study, in this photo, includes 3 grams of NutriSource fiber, which is fiber from guar gum. These 4 glasses of lemonade collectively have 12 grams of fiber, of guar gum fiber, which is close to the current low average daily fiber intake of Americans. But study results clearly showed that the 12 grams of supplemental fiber provided little health benefit. It's not the quantity alone, it's also the diversity. So here's a dinner from this study of minimally processed foods. It has 3 microbiota friendly foods, namely 2 from the salad, that is green leafy lettuce and cucumber, and 1 fruit. And I'm considering tomatoes botanically as a fruit. The shrimp dish also included tomatoes, but the tomatoes in this instance did not qualify to be a gut microbiota accessible food because these tomatoes were accompanied by the presence of cream. Cream is high in pro-inflammatory saturated fat, which undermines the health benefits of the fiber substrate. The accompanying cream therefore disqualifies the tomatoes in the shrimp dish from counting towards the daily total of 6 highly microbiota accessible foods. Even in the short space of just 2 weeks, switching from the standard US dietary pattern to a gut microbiota friendly dietary pattern resulted in a number of significant improvements in risk factors for obesity, inflammation, diabetes, and heart disease. Obesity risk was reduced by bringing down the concentration of ghrelin, a hormone that stimulates appetite, and by simultaneously increasing the concentration of peptide YY, a hunger signal dampening hormone. A 44% reduction in the concentration of high sensitivity C-reactive protein was evidence of reduced inflammation. A 32% reduction in insulin resistance was evidence of diabetes risk reduction. And a 12% reduction in total cholesterol and 18% reduction in serum triglycerides were evidence of reduced risk of heart disease. All of these outcomes were accomplished by changing only how processed the food was. The relative amounts of fat, protein, carbohydrate, and fiber provided to the study participants were the same in both the ultra-processed and minimally processed food conditions. So, doubling up on diverse, minimally processed, fiber-rich foods by eating 6 highly microbiota accessible foods per day makes our gut microbes happy. But to really create nutritional nirvana for your microbes, it helps to engage regularly in huff and puff exercise. So at rest, the human body typically allocates 1,300 milliliters of oxygen per minute to the digestive system. The digestive system takes more than any other system. So huff and puff exercise more than triples the amount of oxygen consumed by the body per minute. But despite this huge increase, the body still feels the need to triage the available oxygen in the blood to maximize the amount of oxygen being delivered to the working muscles during exercise. And that is why the oxygen delivery to the digestive system drops a whopping 55% during exercise. This relative lack of oxygen during exercise actually benefits our commensal microbes, almost all of whom, or all of which, are obligate anaerobes, as we said. They thrive in a low oxygen environment, and they are more able to compete with microbial pathogens in such hypoxic environments. Their enemies, notably the species belonging to the proteobacteria phyla, are aerotolerant and therefore have a competitive advantage in higher oxygen, but not in lower oxygen environments. So, exercise, therefore, is a real benefit to the environment in which the microbes live. So this may partially explain why regular exercise is consistently associated with lower risk of inflammatory diseases and longer lifespans. So researchers at the University of Illinois recruited 32 sedentary undergraduates, 14 of whom were obese, the rest were lean, and put them on a 6-week regimen of progressively more vigorous huff and puff exercise, and then followed them for another 6 weeks after the exercise had ended, during which the study participants returned to their sedentary lifestyle. The impact of exercise on microbial generation of short-chain fatty acids was dramatic and consistent, especially for the non-obese participants. The investigators made sure that the study participants stuck with the same diet throughout the study, so that the changes in the concentration of short-chain fatty acids could not be attributed to changes in food intake. Increases in all 3 major short-chain fatty acids were observed. Acetate, propionate, and butyrate all increased during the exercise period, and all 3 decreased during the period without exercise. And as you may remember, the short-chain fatty acids are important influences on reducing inflammation and dampening the hunger signals. And the major reason for the generation of the short-chain fatty acids are the microbes. That's their favorite metabolite. A quarter of them generate short-chain fatty acids. So it takes me about an hour to cook up a large batch of minestrone soup from scratch on the weekend, and then apportion the soup into single-serving containers that I store in the freezer. During the week, whenever I want to have minestrone soup for lunch, I pop one of these single-serving size containers in the microwave for 8 minutes, and it is ready to eat. This is a relatively painless way to facilitate consumption of all 6 microbiota accessible foods needed per day for optimal disease prevention. I tried the recipe with farro as the grain, but found the result too watery for my taste. So I replaced the farro with whole wheat pasta, which yielded more of a stew-like consistency that I preferred. To boost the diversity of fiber in the soup, I included not 1, but 2 types of legumes. I particularly enjoy great northern beans and small white beans. So, so this is the makeup in terms of the, highly microbiota accessible food content. So 2 veggies, onions and garlic, 1 fruit, 1 whole grain, and 2 plant proteins. So this is an analysis of that recipe. And it shows that most of the fiber is coming from the beans, but a fair amount, 19%, is coming from the pasta and 10% from the tomatoes, and then small amounts from the added herbs. But I like the taste of even more vegetables. So I throw in, broccoli, cauliflower, carrots, and that changes the nutrient composition somewhat. So it's still true that beans have the most fiber, but a greater proportion is now explained by the added vegetables. And the number of HMAFs, the highly microbiota accessible foods, is the same. because we wanted to assure a good distribution around my plate. So no more than 2 from each one of the quadrants of my plate. And then we have to be mindful of the oil that we use in cooking minestrone soup or any other potentially healthful food, because the oils differ in terms of their pro-inflammatory fat content. And pure canola oil is one of the better choices because of its very low saturated fat intake and because of its relatively high composition of anti-inflammatory fats. It has a lot of omega-3 fatty acids, which are well known for being anti-inflammatory. So I do have to confess that for convenience, I do rely somewhat on canned tomatoes. They are processed. We are missing some of the skin. So compromises like this for time-related reasons are understandable, and they're okay. When you can offset by having more minimally processed other foods. But I want to illustrate why canned tomatoes relative to the fresh tomato is not equivalent. And I'm speaking to Congress here because they overruled the dietitians at the USDA when the USDA said, "Oh, we should eliminate pizzas, or not eliminate, but limit the consumption of pizzas because the 2-ounce dollop of tomato paste on a slice of pizza is not equivalent to a raw tomato." And Congress said, "Oh, yes, it is." So in this instance, the ingredients look the same, tomatoes versus tomatoes. But the canned tomato, as I mentioned, is missing the seeds and nuts. It's missing 24% of the fiber value of the raw tomato. So don't be fooled. Mother Nature at the present time is generally your best choice if it's possible, if it's convenient, if you can afford it. So the I have found that a sort of it's almost cheating, to have 4 HMAFs for breakfast, highly microbiota accessible foods, having 4 of them for breakfast, then you only need 2 more for the whole rest of the day. And how do I do that? Well, the cheating is, adding seeds. Seeds are rich in the anti-inflammatory fats, and they're rich in fiber. And so rolled oats, that's minimally processed. The seeds, 1 tablespoon each. So that's equivalent to 2 high protein, highly microbiota accessible foods, and then a banana, a fruit. And so that's my tip for cheating. So you don't have to worry about getting enough high microbial friendly foods at lunch and dinner if you've already gotten 4 at dinner, at breakfast. So it should be noted that almost any, no matter where you came from, where your ancestors came from, it's almost always true that the traditional foodways, whether it be in Asia or South America, whether it be in Mesoamerica or Europe, the traditional foods tend to be richer in fiber and richer in the anti-inflammatory fats than today's Western pattern. So that's why I have these different pyramids. So your commensal microbes will thank you if you consciously expand your repertoire of acceptable whole grains and legumes. Some of these cannot be found in your local Ralph's or Vaughn's grocery stores and may have to be purchased online. Now, I have found that barley, farro, chia seeds, flax seeds, and quinoa are available at my local Ralph's grocery store, but I had to hunt for them. They're not easy to find, and you may find the same thing at your local grocery store. An underappreciated barrier to expanding one's repertoire of diverse fiber-rich foods is what we call food neophobia, fear of the new. Most human beings come into this world with an automatic skepticism of unfamiliar plant foods. That is why most children reject their first taste exposure to solid food. It takes multiple exposures, typically between 8 to 14 taste exposures to a new plant taste, before a child or an adult finds an initially disliked unfamiliar food now acceptable to eat. We tested this on a YMCA cohort of summer camp middle school children, most of them African American. As depicted in the graph shown, these study participants initially disliked the taste of jicama, a food source that they were not familiar with. After getting them to taste at least one mouthful of jicama every day for 3 weeks, 5 days a week, most of the study participants came to actually actively like the taste of jicama. We need to encourage people to continue trying foods that they initially disliked, because repeated exposure to initially disliked unfamiliar plant foods turns out to be the single most effective behavioral strategy for getting people of all ages to eat more vegetables. So there are admittedly some other real world challenges that may impede your goal of pleasing your commensal gut microbes. Happy microbes create gas. Flatulence is annoying. Your body will adapt successfully if you increase your intake of fiber gradually, but the extra gas is still annoying. You will be going to the bathroom more often if you follow my advice. Another inconvenience. On the upside, constipation is less of a problem for people consuming twice as much fiber as the average American. Friends and family may find it awkward at first to accommodate your new food choices, but with reasonable compromises, their concerns can usually be addressed amicably. Another challenge is the extra time required to try out new recipes and to do the washing and cutting of fresh produce that eating minimally processed fruits and vegetables requires. For some families, the extra costs of purchasing specialty foods may require compromises. Despite these challenges, I suspect that you will find that the quality of life benefits and the reduced risk of serious disease associated with keeping your gut microbes happy more than offset these inconveniences. So my hope is that you take home the message that you will benefit personally by magnanimously altering some of your daily food choices, not all of them, for the benefit of your commensal gut bacteria, including just 6 food choices each day that are highly accessible to your commensal gut microbes will help them thrive. When they thrive, they do wonderful things for the well-being of their human host. More specifically, the research is showing that commensal gut microbes thrive when their human host devotes approximately 1/5 of their diet to the following: eats 6 high fiber anti-inflammatory foods every day from all my plate quadrants, limits pro-inflammatory food components such as saturated fat and added sugar, favors anti-inflammatory fats from fish, legumes, nuts, and seeds, and does 30 minutes of huff and puff exercise most days of the week. When the human host does this, then her risk of cancer recurrence is minimized, her mood is elevated, and her immune system is maximally effective in warding off a litany of other inflammation-related health conditions. So these and other behavior change strategies are featured in a study that we are currently conducting at UCLA. We are comparing 2 different lifestyle change strategies for reducing risk of cancer recurrence in breast cancer survivors by reducing inflammation. If you know of someone who might be interested in participating in this study, please refer them to the phone number and email address listed at the bottom of this slide. Thank you for listening. I'm now eager to try answering your questions. If for whatever reason you are not able to get your questions satisfactorily answered here, please send me an email at the address shown in this slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McCarthy, for that information, for the presentation. I think it's awesome information for us to have, especially because it's being recorded and we can have it in our video library. And then for anybody interested in Dr. McCarthy's study, you can definitely email us at info@cancersupportla.org, and we can go ahead and send you the flyer and the information as well.
Thank you, Edlin.
Yeah, no problem. So let's go ahead and get into the questions because we do have a few. The first one is, are vitamin B's good for peripheral, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, neuropathy?
There are many benefits to feeding the microbes well, and one of them is that they generate vitamin B's, all the vitamin B's. Now we can't make use of the vitamin B12 until it's been, jettisoned through the feces, but that's another story. But vitamin B6, you're going to get it from your microbes. So following the advice that I gave you is likely to benefit a variety of conditions, not just peripheral neuropathy, but peripheral neuropathy would indeed be benefited by feeding your microbes better.
Good. Okay, good to know. The next question is, does the fiber-rich diet, does this diet include when you are going through, is it okay, I guess, when you're going through chemo? Is it beneficial, the diet-rich, the fiber-rich diet?
Yeah. So I'm not a clinician. I don't have, insurance to back up my claims. So my advice always, legally is first consult your oncologist. But the American Institute for Cancer Research says generally that what is good for preventing cancer in the first place is good for preventing recurrence. So during the active treatment process, do rely on the oncologist. And I've heard different, suggestions over the years. It's good to have more antioxidants and other higher levels of short chain fatty acids. And then I've heard the reverse, that, the tumor will be benefited by having all these nutrients.
Mm-hmm.
So do rely on the oncologist. But if you want to believe the American Institute for Cancer Research, the survivors will benefit as much as those who are trying to prevent the first occurrence of cancer.
Okay. Next question is there a difference between pure canola oil and regular canola oil?
So I don't know, the difference. So I just purchased the canola oil that is available at my Ralph's grocery store. I know, that olive oil has distinctions, and generally the first press, the virgin press is the higher quality of olive oil. But with regards to canola oil, I don't know. It's an interesting question.
Okay. Next one is Beano anti-gas supplement bad to take with every meal? I don't know if you're familiar.
Yeah. So for cooked meals, I mean, if you let it cool, the Beano is deactivated by heat. So we're talking mostly about cooled cooked foods, like a bean salad. Yes, Beano is helpful in reducing the gas. There's little question about that. Whether it interferes then with the benefits of the microbes getting the substrate that you provided, I don't know. It's a good question. But yeah, Beano does reduce the gas.
Does microwaving versus stovetop change the food value to the gut?
That's my guess, in part because there's a considerable leaching of nutrients that takes place with slow cooking. So the faster you can do the heating and get the result that you want, the more nutrients might be preserved. But again, that's an interesting research question. And so right now I'm giving you my best guess, but I really would like to see research on that question. Exactly what kinds of heat, are going to render the intrinsic fiber less intrinsic. And, yeah.
Okay. Next question is, can you explain again why dairy negates HMAFs?
So HMAFs, that's highly microbiota accessible foods. So those are the microbe-friendly foods. So could you ask the question again?
Yeah, it says, can you explain again why dairy negates the eight?
Oh, yeah. So it's not dairy per se, it's high fat dairy. It's the saturated fat in cream. It's the saturated fat in whole milk that negates the value of the substrate, because once you've got the inflammation, there's a reduced benefit. So as I showed in that slide with the exercisers, typically obese individuals have higher levels of inflammation. And the obese individuals in that exercise study derived less benefit, in part because they have higher levels of inflammation that undermined the value of having the fiber become substrate for the microbes, who then generated the short chain fatty acids that resulted in a reduction in satiety, hunger signaling, and reduced inflammation. So yeah, you want to reduce inflammation as much as you can, and avoiding sources of saturated fat is important to do. But yogurt, non-fat, that's fine. Go for it.
Well, that's good to know. Let's see, next question. What is your opinion on different types of saturated fats? For example, is there some data that dairy fat can be protective? Are some saturated fats worse than others?
Yes, that's definitely true. And conversely, the polyunsaturates, which can be largely anti-inflammatory and are good for heart disease, some are still somewhat pro-inflammatory. So yeah, if you really get into this, then you can start making very fine distinctions. But for the average consumer, the simpler message is limit your intake of saturated fat, particularly from farm-raised animals. When you go for salmon, go for wild salmon, not for the farm-raised salmon, because farm-raised animals, whether they are salmon or cattle, because of the lack of exercise, they end up with much higher levels of saturated fat. And that's just simply not good for the microbes or for you.
Next question. Can too many green veggies upset your hormone balance? Can too many raw veggies upset your hormone balance?
Yeah, so I did neglect to mention a German study, and I forget what the number of participants was. It was in the hundreds of participants, but it's a 20-year-old study, and it showed that participants who went overboard on raw, minimally processed fruits and vegetables, among the women, 25% ended up being undesirably underweight. And so there is a potential problem in going overboard. And that's another reason to limit your intake of HMAFs to 6. So far, epidemiologically, we haven't seen any harm to doing 7, 8, 9, but we haven't seen any benefit either. So why not allocate just 1/5 of your calories to getting those microbe-friendly foods, and then the other 4/5 just follow the dietary guidelines, as hopefully you've been doing already.
Yeah. Okay. Another question is, I need to gain weight following chemotherapy, so have been drinking full fat milk and yogurt. Would it be better? What would be better for weight gain?
So when my wife was pregnant with our son, we confronted this issue because she needed to gain weight. And we had her eat a lot of good fats. So lots of seeds, lots of nuts, lots of avocados, lots of nuts. Nuts are 93%, 93% of the calories come from fat. It's a very high fat food. So the curious thing is, for people who are not overweight, eating a lot of nuts does not cause them to become overly fat. So somehow the body regulates the calories for whatever the right weight level is, as long as they're good fats.
Okay. Another thing, what are your thoughts on taking probiotics? Does that help with the microbe?
That's a very interesting question, and there's a lot of ferment, among the food manufacturers, because now that everybody's recognizing the importance of a healthy intestinal system, everybody wants to create their own patentable probiotics, and we just don't know. I mean, it's just too new. So there is evidence, particularly from the health nurses study and from the physician study at Harvard, where these nurses and physicians have been followed for decades. And there is evidence there that when you eat a lot of yogurt, that you're likely to better control your weight. But if you eat a lot of high-fat dairy, then you end up putting on a lot of excess body fat. So in as much as yogurt has these probiotics, people have attributed the benefits to yogurt versus other dairy products to the fact that yogurt has, through fermentation, or, because it's a fermented food product, it has all of these salutary commensal bacteria.
Yeah.
Now the problem is, and one of the questions in the research that will be done on this is, how many of the probiotics that you consume will actually survive the acid bath in the stomach and all the antimicrobial influences in the small intestine to finally make it to the large intestine. And it's mostly in the beginning of the large intestine where the gut microbiota is most important. And many of the probiotics simply don't survive that long traverse. I mean, that's 20 feet of small intestine, as well as the acid bath. And, most of them don't survive. That being said, there is some, growing evidence, particularly with symbiotics. That's where a probiotic is accompanied by increased fiber, fiber that's known to be substrate for that particular bug. A symbiotic has been found to be important in reducing, for instance, necrotizing colitis in infants. So there's a lot of promise here, but right now we know very little specifically about how probiotics will help.
That's good. Good to know. This other question is there a benefit of lentils versus beans?
So lentils are legumes. So beans are legumes, lentils are legumes. And as long as they're minimally processed, they provide lots of fiber. They're very helpful in reducing inflammation and better controlling weight. The problem is, in India, where I am currently doing some research, they add ghee, which is highly pro-inflammatory. They undermine the value of the lentils, by throwing in this clarified butter, and that's a real shame. So yes, I'm very enthusiastic about lentils or beans of any kind. The greater the variety of lentils and beans, the better off you are. But make sure not to accompany them by pro-inflammatory components.
Yeah. And then it says, in regards to nuts for adding calories for weight gain, what is your stance on peanut butter with no sugar added? Since it's processed, does this take away from its nutritional benefit?
So if you do the blending, then you're likely to have a good product. But better yet, to eat peanuts. So there are a lot of Thai dishes that have peanuts, and when you blend it, that's the researchers have found that when you do home processing, that's not as undermining of the benefit of the substrate as when it's industrially processed. So if you blend it yourself and end up having peanut butter that way, that's ideal. The problem with commercial peanut butter, if you look through most of the products on the aisles in the grocery store, and they've added sugars. They don't need added sugars, but they do because it's a cheap filler. And so high fructose corn syrup is very commonly an added sugar to the commercial peanut butters. And so for most commercial peanut butters, I say, forget it, do it your own or just rely on peanuts out of the jar.
Is coconut yogurt a good source of probiotics for those who are Dairy-free?
Probably not, because unlike most plant oils, the coconut oil is saturated. Now, whether the plant saturated fats are as bad as the animal saturated fats, more research is needed. But I would be cautious about using coconut oil or anything made with coconuts that includes the oil component because of its saturated fat content.
What are your thoughts on a daily multivitamin?
So as any woman who's been pregnant knows, it's good to have multivitamins. You especially want to make sure that you have folate, because you don't want a spina bifida baby. That's a deficiency. That's a consequence of folate deficiency. But that's better probably than trying to micromanage your vitamins. But if you're eating all these fruits and vegetables, you're generally going to get all the nutrients that you need. Ironically, at least from the federal nutrition data collected by the CDC, it looks like the very people who have the most ideal diets are the people most likely to use supplements. So I say, I commend people who are worried enough about their nutrition that they're willing to take a multivitamin supplement. But I don't think it's a requirement if you follow, the recommendations that I made. One caveat, though, is that when you do get older, then there's impaired absorption of vitamin D and vitamin B12. And so at that time, supplements might be appropriate.
This next question is, how gradual is gradually increasing minimally processed food?
So I'd say, add 1 HMAF a week. So give yourself up to 6 weeks to do 6 a day. And so that should be time enough for your body to adjust to the higher level of fiber. Now, I mentioned I have a son, and he comes visiting home, and our daughter-in-law is not quite as nutrition focused as we are. And so sometimes he ends up with some stomach disturbance the first 2 days that he's visiting with us, because all of a sudden there's been a jump in the fiber intake. But he quickly adapts. Within a week, he's happy to eat everything that we eat.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
And then let's see. Can you make a distinction between industrial farming and farmers market farming?
So the principal difference is the reduced use of industrial waxes and pesticides and preservatives. And so when you get it straight from the farm, also, there's also a time element. So when you get it straight from the farm, it's going to be richer. And so there's some water soluble nutrients like vitamin C, which are lost to the ambient air very rapidly after harvesting. So corn on the cob straight from the farm is going to have quite a bit more vitamin C than corn on the cob that's been sitting on the shelf in the grocery store. So if you can afford the time and the expense of foods purchased from farmers market, I strongly encourage you to do that. And particularly if it's organic, that's good for our planet. Organic's not necessarily going to improve our health directly, but indirectly by improving the health of the planet. It's quite clear that we should be buying organic whenever we can.
And then one last question. Any current programs at UCLA to help people with adjusting their diets over time?
I mean, besides the research that I'm doing?
Mm-hmm.
So, UCLA is a huge place. It has the largest population of all the UC campuses, even though its geographic footprint is the smallest of all the UC campuses. So there are all sorts of studies going on, and there are some excellent studies at the Center for Human Nutrition, which I partner with, so I'm a little biased. But they do studies of whole foods, like avocados, and they found some very interesting effects of avocados. But I don't think we have a standing commercial nutrition improvement program of the kind that we're doing studies on. So if that's the question, then no, unfortunately, UCLA it shouldn't be your first choice for, looking for how to eat better and exercise more.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. McCarthy, for your time, for your presentation, again, for this information. It's very valuable, especially to our community, to everybody. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Just want to let you all know that this is being recorded and will be up in our video library in a few weeks. And again, if you're interested in Dr. McCarthy's study, please email us at info@cancersupportla.org, and we can send you that flyer that he was showing, and then any other information that you'd like from this talk. So again, thank you, Dr. McCarthy.
Thank you, Edlin, and I thank all of the audience members. I greatly enjoyed the honor of presenting to this group.
Thank you so much. You all have a good evening.